All right, everyone, welcome to Protesting Police and Policing Protest, a Zoom panel discussion with a distinguished set of scholars about the problems that have given rise to the current wave of protests against policing in America. We're also going to be talking today about the problems that have been created by the policing practices at these protests. I'm Barry Lamb, producer and host of Slate's Hi-Fi Nation podcast, and an associate professor of philosophy at Vassar College. This event is continuous with the fourth season of Hi-Fi Nation, dedicated to the philosophical foundations of crime and punishment in America. The season will release its final episode next week and is available for all of you to enjoy and use in teaching and discussions in perpetuity. This event is co-sponsored by the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics Society, an international organization dedicated to interaction and cross-fertilization of philosophy, politics, and economics in the academy and in public policy. And by the Mark Sanders Foundation, a philanthropic organization committed to excellence in philosophy and promoting philosophy in the public sphere. I invite all of you to check out the websites for PPE and the Mark Sanders Foundation to sign up for more events of this kind. We've had over 500 registrations for this event, so thank you for your continued interest. Now, without further ado, I'd like to go to my panelists for brief introductions.
Thanks so much, Barry. I'm Michele Moody-Adams. I teach philosophy at Columbia University, where I'm the Strauss Professor of Political Philosophy and Legal Theory. My current work is relevant in two ways. I'm working first on the kind of moral renewal of 21st century democracies, but also on the ways in which social movements help to produce constructive social change. And one very, very quick personal note, I come from a family that has experience of both an important representation on the police force in the Chicago Police Department, with the highest ranking Black detective for many years being my father's brother, and my father having been a victim of police abuse of force during that same period, where it made for some very interesting family discussions. So I can see both sides of some of these issues and others see only one side of it.
My name is Ekow Yankah. I teach law at Cardozo School of Law in New York City, not too far away from Michele Moody-Adams, with whom I get to interact on occasion. My work is on the intersection of criminal theory and political theory. So in fact, some of the things I concentrate most on is what are our political obligations to each other? When are we bound both to each other and to the state? How does that reflect in both duties and responsibilities? But most importantly for this moment, how our political obligations are reflected in criminal punishment, criminal justification, and how, when those things are abused, they can erode our obligations to each other, to the state, and to law-abidingness. And, you know, I won't dive into any personal stories just off the top, but you can imagine that my interest in these subjects is a very natural one. It's the combination of what's always been a philosophical love with the way in which I think and struggle with our obligations, in part as an African-American man. So it is vocation and job at the same time.
Brandon Del Pozo?
I am a drug policy and substance use researcher at the Miriam Hospital and Brown University. But on the heels of that, I spent 23 years in policing, 19 years in the New York City Police Department, and 4 years as the chief of police of Burlington, Vermont. During that time, I completed a doctorate in political philosophy at the City University of New York. My dissertation topic was called The Police and the State. What I did was spend my 23 years in policing sort of reflecting on the democratic commitments of policing, what they ought to be, right? Trying to look at what ideal theory in political philosophy might have to say about policing, what it would say if it was made to speak to it, and then comparing that to where we are in policing, which is woefully short, and coming up with an account of how to justify police powers. And I think it's obviously it's time that we we gave that some real serious thought, because we have such a long way to go to reconcile our democratic commitments and the way police act.
Hi, I'm Jason Brennan. I'm the Flanagan Family Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at Georgetown University. The things I work on that are kind of relevant for us today are, I have a book on the right to resist government and how you can react to, say, police violence and other things. as well as recently a book with Chris Sopranant called Injustice for All, which is trying to provide a sort of public choice economics diagnosis of why the US criminal justice system is so unusually violent and so unusually punitive. As far as personal experience, I mean, I've been fleeced by police in Cleveland Heights quite a bit, but beyond that, I have to admit, you know, the police are pretty nice to me, and I don't know why. There might be some reasons for that.
For our panel discussion, let me start with you, Michele. You're finishing a book on U.S. civil rights protests tradition, particularly the nonviolent traditions associated with Dr. King. Now, Black communities have been protesting police violence since the 60s. There was another wave in the 90s, and we've had waves pop up again and again since 2014. Yet we've seen a lot of movement in the last 2 weeks on this issue. Perhaps not the result of, but definitely coinciding with far more destructive protesting. Do you still think nonviolent protest is the right tool?
Gary, I do. I think in large part because the overriding concern at the moment, in particular with trying to continue to welcome cross-racial collaborations that might need to leave room for the possibility that even people who have been active oppressors, and certainly those who have simply benefited from oppression, active or not, that we may need to find ways to create a possibility of reconciliation between the formerly oppressed and their former oppressors. And I think Martin Luther King understood the power of nonviolence as an important method for reliably ensuring the possibility of such reconciliation. I will acknowledge that in a different national context and in a life initially shaped by a very different connection to violence, even Nelson Mandela understood the importance of opening up the possibility of reconciliation. There's this very famous moment when he's ascending to the presidency of South Africa in 1994, and he makes this gesture of support for the South African rugby team at the Rugby World Cup. Nobody expected this from him. People expected, mass violence and upheaval and maybe mass murder on the, people going after white South Africans out of anger. And I think Mandela in his way and King in a different way, but I think sometimes more reliably with nonviolence, understood that if you're going to live in a society that you claim to share with others, a society that's been damaged by wrongdoing, even if you're the victim of it, we need together to come to terms with the idea of reconciliation. And one very quick example, so in my hometown of Chicago, the University of Chicago very recently, 2016, opened up a kind of archive of the police torture records from the 20-year period, 72 to 91, and it's given people a chance to talk about the torture they experienced at the hands of the police, open up the possibility of reconciliation instead of keeping the anger in. That's a start, but I think nonviolent protest is as critical to that reconciliation as anything.
Michele, how convinced are you that the oppressors are as open to reconciliation as you seem to be hoping? What if the oppressed view that this history gives a lot of evidence that they're not as open to reconciliation?
Some are not, and some never will be. And there are certain ways I would talk about reconciliation in the German national context, for instance, that wouldn't claim that everybody who was part of the Nazi movement would be somebody you could reconcile with. I would say the same thing about white supremacy in the US context, national context. But we have to allow for the possibility of transformation of people's moral understandings and people's moral responses to the world. And I have to say, as somebody who has been on a daily basis, frankly, surprised at the number of people who are not people of color marching in these protests, sometimes putting themselves in harm's way in a way that echoes the civil rights movement, I do think it's possible for transformation to occur. Some will never be transformed, but most people seeing that 8 minutes and 46 seconds of video in Minneapolis, or even hearing about it, most decent people don't want to be associated with that. And I think the movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, has very reasonably built upon that wish not to be associated with morality.
Jason, I want to talk to you next on the topic of violence. You've looked at a lot of domestic and international data and the historical trends on the level of violence in US policing since around the time of Dr. King's assassination. let's just get some facts on the table. Just how violent are U.S. police and why?
It's a good question. And unfortunately, the police don't collect very good national statistics that are easily examined. It's difficult to do cross-national comparisons and even comparisons over time. But that said, we do have some numbers that are pretty frightening. So one has to do with sort of the incarceration rate in the U.S. It was in 1971, it was about 150 per 100,000 people. Other countries we'd like to compare ourselves to were about 100. So we were in the pack, but a little bit worse. And then now it's about over 700 per 100,000, whereas other countries have stabilized with low numbers. The police in 2018 in the United States killed 10 people for every bullet the German police fired in the line of duty outside of a firing range. Right, so every time a German police officer fired a bullet outside, American police killed 10 people. When you look at things like, say, the use of SWAT teams, which are used very frequently in the United States, in the year 1981, there were approximately 500 total uses of SWAT teams in the U.S., the entire country. Now it's used about 100 times per day, and only about 93 out of 100 of those will be used for nonviolent drug arrests, and only about 7 for the kinds of things that you would think of as being associated with what a SWAT team is for. So insofar as we have data about the police and the criminal justice system in the U.S., it looks like our police are unusually violent, our system is unusually punitive, and this can't easily be explained by things like even gun ownership or the higher level of crime that we have in the U.S. It's explained by something else.
Why can't it be explained in those ways?
Yeah, in part because the trends don't work out the right way. So if you, say, draw a graph with like all of the different crime rates in the US, including violent crime, and then you try to run a correlation. How does that correlate with measurable police violence, the measurement of police killings? There's basically no correlation. Another problem is that, if you think about what happened to violent crime in the US over time since the 60s, it went up dramatically, though not dramatically enough to explain the massive rise in police violence. And then it went down. It started going down in 1994 and it's been going down since. But yet police violence has continued. When you look at things like the measurable incidence of police violence across the US and then compare that to gun ownership and underlying gun incidents, including black market guns, you don't find much of a correlation. And so it seems like something is going on here that is not explained by the need for law and order or because of underlying problems with crime in the US. It's something else.
Do you have an hypothesis or a series of hypotheses?
Yeah, so Chris Soprano and I, in that book that we mentioned earlier, our major hypothesis is that it ultimately comes down to a wide range of perverse incentives created by unusual structures in the US about how judges and prosecutors and district attorneys are elected in ways that they're not in Europe, about funding models where police are basically being financially rewarded by the federal government and others for engaging in mass arrest, drug arrests, using military equipment. If you accept and use military equipment and accept military training and then learn military tactics and use those, you get extra funding. Even weird things, there's so many of them, even weird things such as one particularly horrifying statistic we have from Connecticut was that it's commonly the case that when you're creating congressional districts, this will be based upon the total number of people in your district, including prison population who might be from somewhere else. And in Connecticut, we found that there are somewhere between 7 and 9 majority white state congressional districts, which would not exist but for a largely black prison population taken from other cities. So that's those are a few of many perverse incentives, which are largely unique to the United States. And we think certain shocks that happened in the 70s sort of put those into action. You don't see that in other countries. And that seems to be why their level of violence and so on is significantly lower.
On this issue, we have a former police chief here. So Brandon, I want to ask you, is it your experience when you used to talk to other police chiefs and maybe now that they are incentivized in certain ways that promote more arrests, more prosecution of low-level crimes, more confiscation of drugs, things like that?
First, before I answer that question, I see my undergraduate philosophy of law professor, Walter Sinnott Armstrong's on this talk, so just wanted to say hi to him.
Hi, Walter.
I think, to answer that question, could easily take the whole hour, but I think so. So number one, for example, in New York City, there was a discrete amount of overtime given for every narcotics arrest done by narcotics units programmatically. We can talk about measuring performance in policing, crime prevention, restorative justice are not measures that can be, are not outcomes that can be easily measured, but you can measure arrests, right? You can measure the number of tickets you're giving. But that said, I mean, I'd like to sort of answer your question from the other direction, is that I think that there's a huge disincentive for cultural change in policing. I've written about that in an op-ed recently, and that's that there's 18,000 police departments in the US, and as long as you can play whack-a-mole or sort of point at another, when something truly disturbing happens in policing, actuarially, it's not going to happen not only in your police department, but not in anyone around you. And so, if this were a few years ago with the case of George Floyd, police departments would have looked at Minneapolis and said, oh, that's Minneapolis over there. Like, we haven't had anything like that happen in years or decades. And I think what we're seeing now is people refusing to accept the fact that although it happens disparately over different jurisdictions periodically, it could happen anywhere. It seems to happen anywhere, and it happens with consistency. So I think that we haven't seen a lot of reform because chiefs were willing to roll the dice on the probability of it happening at home. And cultural change in policing is very hard, so they kick the can down the road.
Ekow, part of the outrage with George Floyd and some other cases comes not just from the persistent patterns of police violence disproportionately inflicted on the Black community, but also from the fact that there seems to be a persistent failure to hold the police accountable through the criminal law. There's always calls for prosecution and conviction and jailing police officers who commit violence like this. But is that a mistake to look to the criminal law and criminal procedure as part of the solution to this problem?
Like everybody, when I see these videos, they are utterly disorientating, they're crushing, they send me into a tailspin. And so like everybody else, I have this instant instinct that what we should do is punish the people and throw them in jail and never let them see the light of day again. But there are a bunch of things that we should notice with that sort of unquestioned or knee-jerk instinct. First of all is that it's not just the case that it is tricky or difficult or, as though it were a sideshow that it's hard to prosecute these police officers. It is baked into the pie that you cannot prosecute these police officers. And I mean that from beginning to end, right? So even before something goes egregiously wrong, people have to understand that our court system and our doctrinal foundations make it the case that courts are going to ignore the role of race in policing, right? So, there's a famous case I teach called Gardner, and it's not about Eric Gardner, who was killed a few years ago in Staten Island. It's actually about a younger Gardner who was shot in Memphis, Tennessee. And that's a case where the court said, look, police officers are not allowed to use deadly force just to capture a fleeing felon. They can only use deadly force if the person is a danger to a police officer or others. But in that case, the NAACP had briefed the question of police violence towards African Americans. It said, look, one of the worries we have is that police use deadly force against Black people who are committing the same crimes. The Supreme Court never touched it. When the Supreme Court turned their attention to pretextual stops, what we now all recognize as the crime of driving while Black, or walking while Black, or sleeping while Black, or barbecuing while Black, what the Supreme Court said was the motivation of a police officer, unless it can be proven that they only targeted you because of your race, has no role to play in whether or not the stop was justified. The same thing is true when prosecutors keep people off juries. Unless you can prove that this prosecutor only for your race decided to keep you off the jury, the courts won't look at it. The death penalty, most famously, proving that the death penalty was imposed in racist ways, the court said, unless you can prove there's racism in this particular case, the fact that the whole system is rife with racism is not going to affect, and on and on and on. So the point is just to notice that our courts are dedicated to not noticing the role of race in the way we are policed.
With respect to the issue of prosecution and police involved shootings, Brandon, you have some thoughts about that as somebody who oversaw a police department.
Thanks. And so first, I'd like to echo what Ekow said. It just occurred to me, a lot of folks will know this on this call, but if you look at the Wren decision Tennessee versus Garner and Terry versus Ohio. I think those three cases, so Terry, Garner, and Wren would give you a real good primer on why we are Supreme Court-wise in American policing, plus maybe also one or two cases about the use of force. But so one of the things to not only I think is what was said by Ekow very insightful, but also consider not just baked into the process, but baked into the nature of policing is a lot of obstacles that are hard to overcome when you're seeking a prosecution. And the goal is to establish doubt. I would say this, so everything that was just said, plus you can, as a police officer, get on the stand, or your defense attorney can say, I was sitting there in my police car doing nothing. This doesn't happen all the time, right? But then I am dispatched. I'm instructed as a condition of my employment to go to a location to meet someone that, is not having an affair with my wife, that is not in a rival gang, that does not owe me money, that I don't have animus towards. And most of the time, not necessarily with George Floyd, but in a lot of cases who I've never met before. And then as part of my job, I was asked to make very difficult decisions about what to do with this person. And I apprehended that I was in danger and I used force. And I think that, so when you layer into that Supreme Court holdings, when you layer into that the fact that the court is explicitly deprives us of the ability to consider race and bias, and then you add that a police officer almost always in these tragic cases, these crimes, these uses of force, is responding to someone they've never met before, that they had no quote unquote pre-existing animus towards as a condition of their employment. It's very easy to, in the mind of at least one juror, establish doubt. So I think it just compounds all of the problems that Ekow brought about, that he mentioned.
I think one thing that's kind of the elephant in the room has been left out, and that's the kind of cultural construction of people of color, particularly African Americans, that's become so simplistic in the current moment. That either you're perfectly good or you're perfectly bad, and the people who are perfectly bad are permanent possibilities of danger. They need to be controlled, suppressed, sometimes hunted, in effect, like wild animals. I think that's what's going on, in fact, in the Minneapolis case. And so much of this kind of marginalization and dehumanization of people of color is much more widespread than we want to admit. That's why juries, trial juries or grand juries, can sometimes look at a video that everybody else says shows that police have misused their power. They've committed some kind of abuse and excessive use of force. And it turns out that no, after all, they were actually responding to an angry Black man who needed to be controlled and suppressed. In fact, I guarantee you that there will be people on that jury, unless they are very careful with jury selection, who will manage to reinterpret the George Floyd video in just that way. At least, I hope they won't, but my fear is that that's exactly what's going to happen. And that marginalization and dehumanization is so deeply embedded in the culture that we don't talk about the ways in which, people who want to defund the police are talking about giving certain services over to other social institutions. Mental health providers, on the whole, when they encounter certain kinds of people of color in certain neighborhoods, they assume they don't get depressed, they don't get anxious, they're just angry. And let's help them control their anger with excessive medication and extreme diagnoses that actually often don't match what they're doing. Or the kind of way in which schools over punish and excessive assertive ways of treating young kids. One kind of offense that in a white neighborhood might go by as he's just a bad kid. In a Black neighborhood, the kid will end up in handcuffs, at age of 8 or 9. So for my part, unless we add in not just the violence of American culture and the mechanisms of police training and the way we treat police after the fact of some misuse of force, but the kind of cultural context in which it's all too easy to, in the end, say, scratch the surface and that boom, before you know it, that person looked like they weren't resisting, but they're so angry all the time. They need to be suppressed and controlled, and the police are just doing what they ought to do.
But Michele, what I'm hearing is that you're not particularly optimistic about defund the police. Instead, you're looking towards other broader cultural changes. What would that be specifically? Would it be things like implicit and explicit bias training? Would it be things like dehumanization training? Or are you talking about things like that rather than defund the police?
That's a really small part of it, actually. I mean, there are people like Jennifer Eberhardt at Stanford and Tom Tyler at Yale who've done lots of interesting work with police departments around this. But I would also add that the efforts of the Department of Justice in the last 3 years to basically undo all the progress that was made on policies and procedures that might have had a chance of reform, consent decrees, informal agreements, things like, setting up citizen task forces. We never got the chance to give them enough time. Some of them do include the bias, anti-bias training and looking at ways in which the trainee can change. But it was also about looking at juries and how, Jennifer Eberhardt's work, which can show you statistically that if somebody looks more, stereotypically in quotes, Black, they would be more likely to get a stiffer sentence in certain kinds of cases than the person who doesn't. She's got all kinds of data to show this. And so it's not just looking inward at the police and just about their training, not to display or to feel or have implicit bias, but looking at the way the broader culture supports a certain attitude towards police work that in the end is dangerous for everyone.
Jason, I want to bring you in on this one for just a second, and then I'll go to Ekow. As someone who looks a lot at how much economic and political incentives, rather than cultural ones, shape the practice of institutions, are you bullish or bearish on cultural changes, things like the removal of Confederate statues or the training of police in various psychological interventions like implicit or explicit bias training, or sociological interventions like diversifying police forces, juries, judges, things like that?
Oh man, that's too hard of a question you threw me. I often teach these this is a PPE event and I teach PPE courses, and every time I teach them, we go through theories from economists and political scientists and legal theorists and others saying, this is what works and this is what doesn't. These institutions work, these ones don't. And students inevitably ask, great, well then how do we get from what we have to that? And I say, if you can answer that question, there's a Nobel Prize waiting for you, because we don't have a good theory of social change. Like Christina Bicchieri is doing a good job on some of this stuff, so I'll give her a shout out, but like, we don't really know how to create mass social change, even though when we know which institutions might be functioning. So even at the end, like if I can say, here are like 30 or so reforms that I would make to change the incentives that police are facing or that prosecutors are facing or even voters are facing, I don't know how to go then make the country do it. I mean, if I did, I would go do that instead.
So we've been speaking about the institutionalization, and I think one of the things that's frustrating when you're engaged in talking about criminal law and criminal justice is precisely the way in which some people, in particular those who are hostile to reform, ignore the institutional parts, right? So there's nothing more frustrating than saying what happened to George Floyd is a matter of deep systemic injustice. To have somebody say, well, here's a white guy who was killed in a gruesome crime, so it happens to everybody. That is not just willful blindness, but there's a cruel sort of purposiveness to it in another way. Keep in mind that with the George Floyd video, it turns out that the institutional state authority that rules on causes of death ruled that it was an accidental killing. If it hadn't been for a video, the arm of the state that tells us what happened would have told us that George Floyd simply suffered some fatal attack. The same with Ahmaud Arbery, right? Ahmaud Arbery, we all got to watch him, as Michele said, being hunted. I mean, this was a video that was sheerly terrifying, right? I could go for a jog, my child could go for a jog, and just have people decide that you look out of place and kill you. But a prosecutor and then a second prosecutor looked at those same videos that we all saw and decided that that was a case of self-defense. So when people are saying, well, look, violence happens everywhere, they're ignoring the fact that, as Michele pointed out, as everybody's echoed, there's a deep institutionalization of ignoring or devaluing Black lives, a way to just see this as, well, these things happen, another body is consumed. The second point I want to make is precisely we're all so furious because of the viscerality of video, but there's also something quite bittersweet about that, right? So I ask everybody in this podcast to imagine, think of your dearest intimate relationship, and say your wife, your husband, your child was telling you about some abuse they were suffering at work, and they've been telling you this for years. And you just kept telling them, oh, I don't think it's that bad. Oh, you're just overstating this. You're overblowing this. And then I were to go with Jason to the Christmas party and watch him humiliated, abused, and treated badly. And then I would turn to Jason and say, Jason, this is stunning. You really aren't treated fairly, right? I mean, the way in which one can ignore what would otherwise be the most thoughtful cries of your fellow citizen and not believe 400 years of grief, pain, and suffering until you see the most graphic video is itself injurious to relationships, right? So I think we need to think about that. And the last point I'll make, just to, again, build off what Michele Moody-Adams said is, I love what I do. I love what I teach. I love my project. But we should all be well aware that and Jason was speaking about how do we fix this. By the time we are talking about problems in policing, we are so far down the line, right? Michele brought up education. We could talk about job training. There's just a million different things we can talk about. By the time we're talking about, should we send armed men to put you in a cage? So many structural things have gone wrong. It's not to say there should never be police. Nobody needs to be simplistic. But all of us who care and teach criminal law are well aware that we're dealing with the back end of a lot of brokenness and a lot of racism in the system. And the reason I think those of us who do it in the way I do it, those of us who are attracted to philosophy do it this way, is because we are somewhere deep inside committed to the idea that if we don't get to the fundamental way in which we think of and justify these actions, then no other change will be fundamentally possible.
Ekow, can I have you, can I follow up on one more thing?
Please.
You've talked about the differential treatment that people give to the suffering of Black lives. You also have been thinking about the reaction to both the slogan and the policy of defund the police coming from this movement versus other points in history. Could you talk a little bit about that now?
Sure. There are a couple of thoughts I have on my mind. One is just sheer frustration, so I'll make it short. The way in which Black protest is always consumed on the most shallow level is insulting, right? Colin Kaepernick was kneeling to protest the most horrific examples of police violence we knew. And the entire debate became about whether or not white feelings were hurt by the very particular way in which he was kneeling. Only in retrospect do people see how absurd it is. Think of going back 50 years and saying, well, the real problem with what's going on in the civil rights movement is the question of whether or not Black power is a polite enough phrase. It would be so obviously absurd. So the idea that defunding the police as a slogan should obsess or take up our energies strikes me as frankly dismissive. Look, defunding the police, I don't know whether it's a great slogan or not. I'm not in PR, but it strikes me that there's nothing radical about the idea, right? So let's take just a couple quick examples. When the Irish or the Italians or the Eastern Europeans were considered too dirty, poor, and illiterate to be Americans, and they were experiencing brutal police violence, people like to say, well, that's an example of how you can overcome racism. But no, that's not what happened. What happened is America started investing in those communities in deep and profound ways, right? After school programs, education, job programs, never mind the GI Bill and the housing benefits that came later. When the Black community, for example, was suffering from disproportionate drug use due to crack cocaine, we set militarized policing mostly to make sure that that stuff stayed over there. We didn't care what happened in their communities, just keep it over there. When America, and in particular white America, experienced a drug addiction of a scale that we had never seen before, 60,000 Americans dead due to opioid addiction, what did we do? We defunded the police. What we decided was you cannot answer fundamental misery by simply policing your way out of it. We started talking about how people trapped in Rust Belt communities without jobs are going to be hopeless and turn to drugs for use. We start talking about rehabilitation, job programs. We start talking about controlling doctors who write too many pills. My point is, when it comes to white communities, defunding the police is a natural reaction. When Black people say it, there's, explosive anger.
Brandon, I want to come to you, and then I want to open the floor up for questions. You were a police chief and an officer for a long time. When you hear calls for defunding the police, and also a cluster of ideas that come with it sometimes, neighborhood or community policing, what do your experiences tell you about the practicability of those ideas?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think just to follow up on Ekow, when he talked about the testimonial, there's a lot of epistemic injustice that's gone on in taking these accounts seriously. And I hope there's someone out there writing a great paper, giving some thought to how maybe George Floyd forced us to pursue some epistemic justice as well as some practical justice. I find I hate, I shouldn't say I hate anything, but community policing is such a nebulous concept that anything can fit into it. That's why we haven't gotten meaningful reform, because anything that I invite citizens to my meetings, I give them some input into my policies, I have coffee with adults and ice cream with kids, like all of that could be community policing. There's no commitment to what the fundamental role and mission of policing is, and the idea of community policing. It's some sort of veneer that ascribes to being some sort of method. I think that, to skip over a lot of underlying philosophical work, what intrigues me when I hear police talk, and when we got on a very idealistic bent about what we do, it was about getting people home safe. It was about reducing violence. It was about reducing fear. It was about reducing homicides. And then it occurred to me, as I looked at the opioid crisis and I looked into public health, that a lot of what we were talking about was idealistically was improving a community's health, right? If you look at the definition of public health, it's the population level reduction of morbidity and mortality. It's systematic interventions that help people live longer, healthier lives. And when cops are very idealistic, if you grant them that idealism, they say, I'm there to get people home safe. And what I hear them saying is, I want communities to live longer, healthier lives, but then they stop at these very insufficient endpoints. How are you going to do that? Well, I'm going to make arrests. I'm going to seize drugs. I'm going to seize guns. I'm going to give tickets. I'm going to incapacitate you in incarceration. And we allow police to use those surrogate endpoints to say they're succeeding at reducing violence and making healthier communities. And then there's this huge disconnect because of all of the bias and racism built in, and then also the iatrogenic effects of the work. Incarceration has iatrogenic effects. Just police violence, even if you're saving a life by using force, has an iatrogenic effect. And so what I'd love to do is to have a mayor and a city council sit down when a police chief is candidate is trying to get a job. And instead of saying, what will you do to bring community policing to my city? Because then they'll be able to say all of these, I'm going to involve citizens and all of this stuff. It just hasn't worked. I'd love a mayor or a city council to say to that person sitting there trying to become a chief of police, what will you do to make my city a healthier city? And what will you do to reduce morbidity and mortality at the population level? And if you hold them to that goal, I don't want to hear anything unless it's going to explain to me what living longer, healthier lives means in my city and how policing contributes to that. You're committing them to a line of reasoning that they've gotten away with not having to address in years. They've been able to visit all of these harms, like I said, and I'll wrap it up by stopping at these surrogate endpoints of arrest, incarceration, giving tickets, seizing kilos. None of that has contributed to healthier, more stable, more resilient communities. But when cops are on their bandwagon saying what they do, they say, we create better, safer communities. There's an incommensurability problem between the language of justice and the language of health that allows police to come very short of a commitment to those goals. And I want to bridge that by sort of bringing policing under the umbrella and the conceptual rubric of public health, if what we're looking to do. And then defunding will follow. They might have to get out of a lot of the mental health business, get out of a lot of addiction business, understand that the ways to reduce violence don't involve these acute situational violent interventions. And I think if we really hold chiefs to articulating their goals in those terms, we'll get, if we're diligent about that, we'll get a lot of the defunding will happen Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think it'll happen organically as police have to cede power to people that can actually get that job done.
Great. We have a long line of questions coming from the audience, so I'm going to open it up now. Simone has been curating those questions for us, and she will be asking them to each of our panelists, and I invite you to answer them. Simone.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Barry. So we have a lot of questions here. I'm going to run through them and maybe create compounds as possible, and I apologize to anyone that we don't get to. So the first set of questions, which are from Kevin, Karishma, and William, respectively, relate to resource allocation and policing. So people are asking for concrete policy suggestions from our panelists, and I'll just read William's question. So William writes, many people are calling for a reallocation of police funding to other civil services, such as mental health services. Homelessness prevention is something that Kevin mentions in his question. What sort of information do we need to be looking at from our city managers and police officers in order to create a concrete plan to present to our city councils?
I still think that unless we accept the fact that those other social services are often as rife with institutional racism as police departments are, we're just transferring the problem to some other agencies. And I repeat, schools, when they treat bad behavior, for instance, of children, or when they treat various problems that are found in all kinds of populations, they get treated differently in communities of color, particularly communities of African Americans. So you can come up with the suggestions, but unless you are willing to say, and we're going to do what we can to root out the effects of the institutional racist conceptions of some people that damaged them through the services we provide, the services are going to just reproduce the same problems under different labels.
I guess I'd add in a couple of things. I agree with everything that Michele said. There's a well-known phenomenon, you can Google this, it's called the Washington Monument Effect. It's this perverse thing that happens with bureaucracies where when you threaten to take away their money, their reaction is not to close down the stuff that doesn't matter that no one needs, but to close down the most popular things. So the example would be the National Park Service will close down the Washington Monument that everyone loves to go to rather than some obscure national park in Montana that gets 5,000 visitors per year. And they do that in order to get the public to react in their favor. Now, if police are willing to kill someone on live video while everyone watches, I presume they're willing to do that as well. So I think, yes, we have to worry about police allocation and funding this and that, but I think a lot of it has to come down with how are police getting funded? You know, we have perverse incentives such as even though adding a well-trained, I mean, I feel in my heart I'm somewhat anti-police, but I'll say this anyways, it's like adding a well-trained police officer to the streets has a pretty positive effect on crime reduction if they're simply patrolling and so on, despite all the horrible things that are associated with that. But cities will often choose, instead of doing that, to sort of push for greater incarceration and so on, because they pay for the police officer, but the state and the other taxpayers pay for imprisonment and incarceration. When it comes to ripping off people and taking money from them and so on, there's so many towns that are dependent upon this. And you might think about a simple rule like, what if there was a rule that said, when you take money from drugs, when you take money from when you engage in civil asset forfeiture and so on, when you collect fines, you, the state and the city that do this, are not allowed to keep that money. That money has to go to victim restitution funds. It has to go to funding the kinds of programs, positive programs that other people have been talking about on this panel, rather than going to pay for other things or paying for the police themselves.
I think we can safely get rid of all the equestrian units in American policing. And it's funny, there's already a few agencies that said, oh, I'll get rid of my equestrian unit, you know, sort of like, thanks a lot. But also, really quickly, narcotics, right? I mean, I asked the DEA when I was the chief of police, what's your strategy to raise the price of drugs? They said, what do you mean? I said, you're taking a total supply side interdiction approach to the drug crisis, and you're seizing all these quote unquote kilos. How will this affect the price of drugs? Narcotics work has never affected the price of drugs. The whole strategy of narcotics work is flawed at its core, and then arresting people for possession has not deterred anybody who's in a state of addiction from continuing to seek drugs. So I think we can take a lot of value out of, literally, narcotics enforcement in the U.S. with very little downside.
The next question relates to punition and carceral culture. So many of those interested in reducing the role of police in our society are also interested in reducing the footprint of the carceral system. And of course, this can result in certain tensions when you're someone who is, say, committed to prison abolitionism, and also calling for imprisonment as a means to justice in cases of police brutality. And so we have a few questions that kind of mine this scene. So I'll read one from Claire. So Claire asks, regarding the question of whether and how police should be prosecuted, there is another point that the panelists have not discussed as yet: whether a carceral mentality is actually desirable, whether putting people in cages actually makes the world a safer, better place, and whether advocating for people to be put in cages harms us as humans. So Claire says, these questions are also immediately relevant, and she'd be interested in hearing from the panelists on this. And Dina also has a related question.
I've been giving this some thought lately. You know, sometimes I have friends with whom I argue about whether I count as an abolitionist, right? And I say, and the nice thing they say to me is, we are so far from where we need to be that if you're an 80% abolitionist, first off, like, we'll argue with you when we get there. So look, I think there are going to be people, when I see Derek Chauvin just crush the life out of a man, I think you are not somebody who can be a fellow citizen right now, right? And that's true of certain very violent crimes. You know, I teach criminal law, so I spend time dwelling on some things that people do that are just truly horrific. And you think, you are not ready to be a fellow citizen right now. So I'm not, in that sense, entirely anti-carceral. What I do think there are two important things to your point about carcerality. One is, I've recently written about the right to reintegration. If you don't view the point of criminal punishment as punishing rights violations and bringing sort of desert and hell down on those who've done wrong, rather you think it is a deal about being a fellow citizen. When you have shown that you can't accord us the kind of way we need to live together, then we need to make sure that you can do that. But that also means the flip side of that is, when you're punished, we are in some way focused on making sure when you return to us, you can be a fellow citizen. And that includes economic and political rehabilitation. As much as I care about voting rights and as much time as I've spent on it, I'm stunned at how little we care about economic rehabilitation and other ways. The second thing I just say is about mass incarceration. My latest paper is about how we should attack mass incarceration. And I argue, in ways that some people might find controversial, that if you come from a community that's already been mass incarcerated, a community that's overpunished, you should just be, the shape and length of your punishment should be reduced, right? And the easy analogy is this: if two parents are arrested and they have a small child, judges will quite often sentence them in different ways or stagger their sentence in order to allow somebody to take care of the child. And the same thing is true if you gut a community. If you take enough people out of a community such that the community is no longer healthy, we need to consider those third-party effects as well. We need to not just think of people who commit crimes as cancers in their community, but realize that they're connected to families and friends and neighborhoods as well. So those are two philosophical attacks. I know they're philosophical, but serious philosophical attacks that say we can punish people while still thinking of them as fellow citizens and keeping civic structures healthy.
There is this notion of civil death that we said as a nation we had given up on, and the idea of the kind of collateral consequences that follow from various sorts of punishment people have. And Ekow has pointed out that sometimes we claim somebody's done their time and paid their debt, so to speak, to society, but having a record of a certain kind imposes a kind of stain on your life and your character for the rest of your life in ways you never get over. And I think if we are going to preserve any kind of a system that puts people away for a while, I personally think some people should be put away, not everybody who is there now, but we've got to address the collateral consequences phenomenon. And we have to do away with the idea that implicitly some kinds of crime and some kinds of incarceration as a consequence of the crime mean you're subject to death, and civil death rather, and your citizenship is effectively destroyed. So I appreciate Ekow's comments very much on that.
Jason, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I agree with what they've said, and I'd add a few things too. Incarceration is a surprisingly ineffective method for most of the things that people care about. And if you think about it, it's obvious. First of all, here's a number. About 27% of people who are right now behind bars in the United States have not been convicted of a crime. A large percentage of people are there because they're awaiting they have pretrial detention. And what do we do when you're a poor person who's committed a crime? We put you in a camp with other criminals and make you lose your job and make you lose your connection to your community and make you lose your connection with your family and basically ruin your life, and then keep you in prison where, in order to stay as safe as possible, you have to adapt certain kinds of bad behaviors which make it difficult for you to reintegrate into society. So it's odd, like we've grown up with prison as the way we've punished people, and it's weird that we have. Why would we have come up with this? So if you look historically, there's so many other ways that societies punish people, including just simply making you pay restitution to your victims, and sometimes maybe punitive additional funding, something punitive to show that it's not simply about your ability to pay off your victims. Why don't we use that instead? Chris and I, in our book, we have a whole chapter called Incarceration on Trial, and as sort of a thought experiment, not really a serious suggestion, but it's a thought experiment, we go through and say, take caning as done in Singapore and compare that to incarceration. On almost every single measure that you could come up with about what you think criminal justice is for and what your outcomes you're trying to come up with, caning is much better than incarceration, and it's not as cruel. One way to prove it's not as cruel is that the criminal justice system itself says it's not as cruel. If I were to take you, Barry, and hit you a bunch with a cane, I would get a certain amount of jail time. If I beat you up with a cane, I might go to jail for 3 months. And if I were to lock you in my basement for 3 months, then I'd go to jail for, say, 5 years. So the criminal justice system itself says that physical violence is not as bad as incarceration. And that's the tool that we use. Now, again, I'm not saying therefore we should use caning, but I just want to note we are so accustomed to this practice that we think it's normal. It wasn't historically normal, and we know it's not effective. We know it increases in recidivism. We know that it ruins families. We know that it blights communities. Why don't we try something else that works and reserve it for the small percentage of people who are genuine, ongoing, violent threats to others, and that's the best that we can do for them. And even then, we don't have to imprison them the way that we do in the US, where we make TV shows where you simply gawk at the horror of prison like Oz. We could do it the way they do it in Sweden or elsewhere.
Simone?
We've had several questions for Michele concerning her work on nonviolence. And several of them ask for a definition of violent protests. People ask whether rioting constitutes violence, whether looting constitutes violence. Obviously questions motivated by the present moment. So I'm just going to read the question from Daniel, who writes, I wondered what violent protest means to you, and whether you would also urge protesters to avoid protest generally that breaks the law. The most obvious cases of violence are those involving bodily harm to other people, so for example, the murder of George Floyd. But a lot of the actions of recent protesters that have been labeled as violent are not like that, but rather involve the destruction of property. If you include the latter when you talk about violent protests, I wonder what it is that marks them out as violent.
This is one of the hardest sets of questions for anybody to answer. I mean, I will start very quickly by saying, I understand that even when a protest movement is principally nonviolent, it's always framed by violence or the threat of violence that allows the nonviolence to, when it does have effects, to have its effects. So I don't pretend any kind of, Pollyanna-ish view about nonviolence being able to take place totally separate. I don't know that I can give you a definition of violence that would satisfy every worry we have, but I think it's partly about doing things that limit the autonomy of agents or deny their right to control either their own persons or certain objects that are rightly recognized as objects they ought to have control over. I think violence can be psychological. I think, serious violence that harms people can be psychological. So it isn't all about physical violence. It's about using your power over other people in ways that are meant to deny their autonomy or limit it or constrain it. I don't deny that some forms of violence may be necessary for justice. I would not want the Civil War to have gone any other way than it did. I wouldn't be sitting here on this call if it had gone differently. I don't deny that, there are times when, I'm not a pacifist. There are times when I think violence in war, more generally, may be the only way, as a last resort, But I still think that when we look at the ways in which it's possible to respect people's autonomy in ways that open up the possibility for them to acknowledge their wrongdoing when they've been oppressors, and if they don't acknowledge it, your last resort may be violence, but to open up the possibility of reconciliation. King talks about, borrowing from Josiah Royce, the idea of a beloved community. And it's not, people think sometimes it's a religious notion, it's really a notion of a community in which people engage with each other as respectful and compassionate participants, co-participants in a shared enterprise. And what that unfolds out to be over time is, not obvious, but sometimes violence can get us there. That's Mandela's point. He wanted nonviolence. He needed violence to get there at the beginning. So, any activity that without a regard to the possibility of justice is limiting people's autonomy in certain kinds of ways, I think of that as violence, or meant to try to limit it. I hope that makes sense.
Okay. We are at the 7 o'clock hour, but I would like to give everyone an opportunity to answer one more question. So I was hoping that Simone can have one question that you think each of our panelists can provide some insight on.
So I have a very long list of questions here. So we have a set of questions about firearms, and we also have a set of questions about militarization. So maybe some of you can do some incredible philosophical synthesis. I'll put these both to you and then you can choose among them. Sure. Okay. So on the firearms front, Vance and Daniel are both interested in how we're going to achieve thoroughgoing police reform when our nation is awash with firearms, and asking whether we can discuss the first topic, police reform, independently of the second topic, the reform to American gun rights. So that's the first question. And then the second sort of set of questions relates to the militarization of the police. So several people were curious to hear more about the militarization of the police and raise questions about, what effect that has on the culture of, an organization purportedly aimed at community service. So Ruth writes, I'm curious to hear more about militarization. I think anecdotally, at least, that America has a much larger military and more veterans, many of whom enter the police force than peer nations. Do you think that our military culture has a trickle down into policing culture? And what are the implications of this militarization at the level of federal policy? So firearms or militarization? Go for it.
Brandon, do you have anything insight about this?
Yeah, listen, I was thinking about this morning. It's quoted in Newsweek today, in fact, saying we're a nation that has more guns than people. And, police use of firearms is symptomatic of the nation's violent obsession with firearms. And I think, however, police, Graham versus Connor is the standard for the use of force set by the Supreme Court. And it's a very low bar. I had an op-ed in the New York Times last November saying the police need to fundamentally rethink their relationship with their guns. They use their firearms as a problem-solving tool and a persuasive device rather than just life insurance. Screaming at people, drop the gun, drop the knife, get on the floor. People in crisis, they don't respond to that. The biggest kickback I got to that, the most vitriol, was from cops. I lost a nation of police officer fans, if I ever had them, overnight by just saying we need to be stopping so juvenile in our relationship with guns. Militarization, so veterans are overrepresented in U.S. police forces. And I think it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where, so the tactical vests that cops wear in all these jurisdictions on patrol don't look like traditional police uniforms. They were an ergonomic improvement for carrying loads on the battlefield that made their way into policing, and that attracted people who kind of missed that military lifestyle and that sense of camaraderie, and they wanted to go to sleep in their own beds at night and still live a military lifestyle, and ended up joining the police. And then the accoutrement just helped reinforce that. I can't get into the whole, just for the sake of time, the whole militarization of policing, except to say it's largely unnecessary. It's a huge problem, and there are studies that show that the more militarized a police force is, the more likely it is to resort to violence and all sorts of things, but especially search warrants. So it's a huge problem in policing.
I would be cautious about, I hate the word militarized, because in fact what people usually mean is more weaponized, with weapons that are more powerful and armor that's more protective. Because in fact, the military culture, if you look at the way in which General Mattis, for instance, and several people in the last week or so stood back and said, don't use the military in this way against the civil population. we should swear our allegiance to the Constitution, not to law and order in the domestic context. So I'm not saying good or bad about the veteran presence in the military. I think it's sometimes actually for good, but when it's not because the police are becoming militarized, but because they're using weapons that are more fully associated with the military and that don't belong on city streets. And the best military men will tell you that.
I just want to say really quickly, and I was in the infantry, you're exactly right. And if by militarization, we actually meant something like discipline, teamwork, precision, skills, right? All of the values that make, the military, this team that excels at accomplishing something difficult, that would be great. We mean something much more juvenile than that. And that was a great point, Michele. Thank you.
Ekow, do you want to have any closing words?
Sure. I mean, so I want to pick up on this and I'll just make a minor and a major point, right? And here, I had a chance to write to Brennan when he published that op-ed, and I told him how much I admired it. Look, the minor point is that our laws are structured so that the police are only in violation of the Fourth Amendment if they seize you. Seize, by the way, is the language we use for killing you. If they kill you because it was unreasonable, right? Only if it was unreasonable. And that means that, as Brandon pointed out earlier, if a police officer can come up with a story, Michele said this was same, if a police officer can come up with a story about how they reasonably feared for their life, the Fourth Amendment blesses it. Morally, we would never think like that. Morally, once you're past 15, the question your parents ask you is, was it necessary to hit that other boy? Not was it reasonable to hit that other boy? And so, one thing we could do is start making our laws reflect our best values and start asking, was it necessary for the police to behave this way? But the major point I want to make is that part of the note in militarization, for a moment sidestepping the lovely conversation between Brandon and Michele, is I think the worry is the idea that the military views itself as there to control another population, not their fellow citizens. And that was the overwhelming tone of Mattis's letter to the Atlantic. Like that these are our people. And one of the things that's true in American policing, in particular, if we're really honest, because of the long racial history of American policing, but not just the racial history, but it's police officers being trained that it's the sheep and wolves, it's our job to control those people over there, rather than seeing them as these are fellow citizens to whom we will return at the end of the night. And if we saw that, then obviously we would do what wealthy communities of power do. We would look at the way in which some people are policed and say, that is unacceptable, right? That is not how we police ourselves, rather than viewing it as those people over there being policed.
Jason, do you have any final words?
I'll just confine it to the question of militarization. I would agree that there's something bad about that word because, as many officers have pointed out recently, the rules of engagement that soldiers have on the battlefield in a foreign country are often much more restrictive than the rules of engagement that police officers have when engaging with us as citizens. The amount of risk that soldiers are expected to take on to themselves on behalf of foreigners is often higher than the amount of risk that our own police are expected to take on behalf when they're interacting with us. If you'd like to read a really good book on how military tactics and military weapons and military interventions that were used to suppress foreigners in wars came home to the US, Abigail Hall and Christopher Coyne recently published a book called Tyranny Comes Home that's all about how this happens, and I'd recommend that.
Thanks, Jason. Well, thank you everybody for coming to this event, Protesting Police and Policing Protest. If you are interested in these topics, I want to plug Hi-Fi Nation once again, although you probably came here from Hi-Fi Nation. This whole season has been on the philosophical foundations of crime and punishment. And I also invite you to visit the websites of the PPE Society, Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, and the Mark Sanders Foundation. We're going to have more events like this, but thank you, everybody. I thank our panelists for a great 1-hour discussion.